turn to please. Just a reminder to please mute your microphones if you're not talking, and then if you want to ask a question, you can unmute your microphone. Welcome back. We're getting into the middle of the book, and that's exciting. It's also at times this book is long and can be a bit grinding, and I hope these chapters and these pages were interesting. There's a lot of discussion of Adam Smith and Karl Marx and John Locke here. It's important for us to sort of pay attention to that, but also to not lose track of what's really going on here and what Hannah Arendt is after. So just a quick reminder and recap. The book is asking after what's called the human condition. The human condition is understood as having three basic faculties or characteristics, which she says have characterized and have been the condition of a particularly human kind of life for a long time. Those are labor, work, and action. We are now trying to read through the last part of the labor section. In her mind, one of the great innovations of her book and of her analysis is what she calls this distinction between labor and work. Labor is the activity of our body through which we produce necessary things so that we can live. It's a kind of toil, and throughout history, we've wanted to overcome labor. Work, on the other hand, is an activity of the hands and of the brain, and it isn't a response to necessity. It's a response to the need for a human world, a lasting world, and thus a world of duration and in the end, freedom. The two central chapters or sections of this chapter are 13 and 14. We discussed 13 last week. Quickly, it's called Labor and Life. And the basic thesis of chapter 13 is that labor equals consumption equals life. Very clear. Now, that's an equation. It needs to be filled out, and I think we did so a bit last class. But the basic idea is that in laboring, we produce things that respond to necessities, whether it's bread or clothes or sustenance of any kind. And those things we produce are not meant to last. They're meant to be used to keep ourselves alive. And so we labor and we consume them, and it's part of what she calls a process of life. It is in Greek a zoological process, zoological because it's connected to the life of man in his animal-like state. The confusion of modern terms is such that we today refer to that as biological, whereas for the Greeks, bios was a specifically human way of life, and Arendt argues that this is not a specifically human way of life to be under the processes of labor. So that was the arguments of chapter 13. Chapter 14, which is really a continuation of chapter 13, is called Labor and Fertility. And this chapter could simply be understood as the same as the last chapter, namely labor equals consumption equals life, with now the addition of the word fertility, to which will be added at the end of this chapter, happiness. The basic idea here is that Marx, like all great thinkers, has a fundamental contradiction running through his work. namely that on the one hand, he talks about how labor is an eternal necessity and is a response to eternal necessity. And on the other hand, Marx says that the revolution, the communist revolution, will free man from labor. And he says, and Arendt says this is a fundamental contradiction in his work that has tried to be justified by most of Marxians. But the only way to really understand it is to understand that the revolution, which frees man from labor, is not actually is not actually core to the Marxist understanding. The core to Marxist understanding, and the most fundamental and foundational idea in his work, is that labor is raised to the highest rank, right? And this is how the chapter starts out. The first sentence of the chapter is the sudden spectacular rise of labor from the lowest, most despised position to the highest rank as the most esteemed of all human activities began when Locke discovered that labor is the source of all property. So she's here adding to her equation of labor equals consumption equals life equals fertility, this idea that labor, life, consumption, and fertility have also been raised to the highest levels and highest ranks. And that, of course, requires that certain other things be lowered. The other aims of life, human life, besides simply its continuity, its perseverance, its life, the good life, the moral life is one example, but also the great life, the life of action, the life of freedom is another, which is not the same as the good life. The other main idea introduced in this chapter, and it's an idea that we've probably mentioned once or twice, but will come to play an enormous role at the end of the book, is the idea of process and processes. So if you look at page 105, and near the bottom, you'll see that she says, historically, political theorists from the 17th century onward were confronted with a hitherto unheard of process of growing wealth. There was a process where wealth was growing, property was growing, acquisition was growing. And that they came to see this as a process that was, in a sense, natural. And she goes on a little below, from its beginning, this process, because of its apparent endlessness, namely, you can continue to grow wealth and accumulation endlessly, was understood as a natural process, and more specifically in the image of the life process itself. Namely, life grows. Human life, remember what she said, dies. It ends. Human life is not cyclical. It's linear. Human life has a beginning and an end, and what makes human life meaningful is the story of that human life from the beginning to the end. But the process of accumulation is endless and is cyclical. Money begets money. Power begets power. And life begets consumption, begets fertility, begets life in an unending process. And that is, for Arendt, the basic understanding of what it means to labor. And it is this, and what she's worried about, right, is how in raising labor, in raising labor in order to keep ourselves alive to the highest end, and thus consumption to the highest end, we reject those aspects of human life and human being which are not cyclical, which are individual, which are about action and spontaneity and memory and lastingness. And in a sense, we turn all life, we turn the highest activity of human life into one of animal fertility. So that is very much, as I understand it, the argument of chapter 14. So why don't I stop here and see if there are questions about chapter 14. And if you have them, you can either write them or unmute your mic. And maybe this is, at this point, you're all getting this and we can move on. But I'm happy to wait a second and see if there's questions about chapter 14. All right. I'll go on. Chapters 15 and 16 are sort of specific inquiries into consequences of this idea of the rise of labor and its process-like character. Chapter 15 is called The Privacy of Property and Wealth. If you want, you can add in 2 words to that title, which will make it a little bit more understandable. It's the privacy of dead property and living wealth. And the point of this chapter, which again is quite complicated at times, is that property, and when we own property, we own something in the world, whether it's a house or a car or land, or a nice pen. And because it's in the world, we relate to other people through it. People know us through it. It becomes associated with who we are. And such property is directed both towards our private world. It's what separates us from the common world, and yet it also connects us to the common world. On the other hand, when we start to switch from a situation of property to a situation of growing wealth, right? And this is something we've talked about now 2 or 3 times during this text. And it's a distinction that for Hannah Arendt is obviously very important. The move from a property owning regime to a regime in which we own wealth and we acquire wealth. And for Arendt, she just talks about this primarily on pages 115 through 116 of the Human Condition here. Property, she says, protects us against the common on page 115. And yet, about 7 lines from the bottom, property does not strengthen, but rather mitigates the unrelatedness to the world of the laboring process. It mitigates the way in which labor, which is often very private, is unrelated to the world. Property connects us to the world because it gives us worldly security. If we turn to 116, she says, the matter becomes altogether different if the leading interest is no longer property, but the growth of wealth and the process of accumulation as such. This process can be as infinite as the life process of the species. So here's the move that she's making. If we've said in chapters 13 and 14 that life equals labor equals consumption equals fertility that is unending, property actually is inconsistent with unending labor. And so we need to replace labor with wealth, with the process of unending accumulation. That also means we need to replace individuals with socialized man so that wealth can continue past individual death, which is why man becomes social man, societal man, or Gattungswesen for Marx. She then talks about how Marx's labor philosophy is really to be understood as parallel to Darwin's philosophy of the origins of mankind. Mankind evolves in a process that follows natural laws. Similarly, labor and economy evolve according to processes that follow laws of accumulation and wealth that are disassociated from individual people and become part of a socialized emergence of a social sphere that is neither private or individual nor public and political. I want to just focus then on the last couple sentences of this chapter, which are on 117 to 118. She writes at the bottom of 117, Marx predicted correctly, though with an unjustified glee, quote, the withering away, unquote, of the public realm under conditions of unhampered development of the productive forces of society. So if we socialize men and we create a biological process, right, we lose control over that process as men who can govern ourselves, and it becomes a natural scientific process that happens whatever we do. We can't really control it. And then she continues, and he was equally right, that is, consistent with his conception of man as an anima laborans, as a laboring animal, when he foresaw that socialized men who live in this social sphere of the process of labor, spend their freedom from laboring in those strictly private and essentially worldless activities that we now call hobbies. In other words, if you are part of a laboring society and you are able to support your life and the life of society without working all day, what do you do with your free time? And Marx had said, we will take up hobbies, tennis, golf, painting, etc. And the footnote, footnote 65, she says, in communist or socialist society, all professions would, as it were, become hobbies, right? All professions would become hobbies. You wouldn't actually become an artist or a painter or a lawyer or a professor, except to the extent that you find it to be fun, that it passes the time. Because there would be no painters, but only people who, among other things, spend their time on painting. You're not a painter, you're a laborer. You make money, you earn money, you labor, and then in your free time, you do things that are fun. This idea of the hobbyist is something that she is going to return to at numerous points in her text, most explicitly in section 17 on consumption, which we're going to get to in a second. But let me stop here and see if there's any questions so far about this idea of private dead property and living life process, fertile wealth. I see some written questions. So someone, Joseph Lichty says, entering mid-book, but what does she mean by worldless? So we've talked a lot about that, Joseph, already. Basically, the world for Hannah Arendt is the human world. It's a world that continues to exist. It's the world of it's the world that has lastingness and duration to it. And let's say you and I have a table or a house or monuments or artworks that continue to exist over generations. They become things that you and I can talk about and share. And in talking about and sharing them, we create commonalities. We create a common world. We may disagree about much in the world, but we all know that the world has the White House in it. And we all know that the world has, the Washington Monument and other things. And as much as we disagree, these durable goods, products of work, last and provide us with a common sense of a shared world. Also, stories of democracy, stories of Walt Whitman, things we all share. What she's talking about is as we elevate labor over work and abundance and accumulation, and we're going to get to this in chapter 17 very explicitly, even cars and houses and even artworks become consumable, become things, because we have an abundance of wealth. We need to spend that wealth on something. And so we buy new houses and we constantly redo our houses. And the whole idea of a family estate or a cultural good, Shakespeare gets we don't reproduce Shakespeare every year on stage. We make new movies with new actors and new things because we have new money and we need to spend it. And so what she's saying is the common world is increasingly lost, and we all are engaged in consuming things that don't last, and thus we lose that which holds us together. There's another question beyond her discussion she does about the meaning of property to the worldliness of man, namely that property creates lasting things that help keep a shared world. Could her distinction of property and wealth be understood as a critique, I assume, a critique of the worldlessness produced by the capitalism when it frees labor from its traditional constraints? So if I understand this, the traditional constraints of labor are that it is largely private, and the laborers are often kept in the house and not visible. And as labor has become more public and more widely known, and laborers have more power in the public realm, does this lead to a kind of worldliness? And her answer is yes. But the real thing is that everyone becomes a laborer. Presidents become laborers, academics become laborers, and so from her point of view, the emancipation of labor into the world means that all of us, to a certain degree, see making a living, keeping ourselves alive, keeping the economy going as our primary activity. And in so doing, we focus on consumption, not on durable goods, durable things. We're going to get a lot more to world in the chapter on work. That's the chapter on world, which comes next week starting. So we'll have more time to talk about it in that way. Let me go to chapter 17, at least. Well, chapter 16 on the division of labor is interesting in many ways. I don't know if there's any questions about it, or does anyone want to say something? I'm gonna look at what Bob has written. What tangible things constitute wealth for Arendt? Is it just a translation of property into some accounting entry? That's a good question, Bob. Yes, I think it is it is to a large degree, wealth is the abstraction of real property. And yet I don't think it has to just be accounting. So, again, I'm having to somewhat guess here. She doesn't write this as explicitly as one might like, but I would imagine that for Arendt, a house one inherits from one's ancestors. And I'm just using this as an example because it's one I think we can all at least understand, that has a certain gravitas and stories, and you remember playing it as a child, etc., is a kind of property. Whereas a house you build and rebuild and tear down when you sell it and then rebuild it again, is still a kind of property, and yet is also it is a house and a piece of property, but one understood more and more along the lines of wealth. If you have a car that you fix up over many years and hold on to, even though it's eventually going to, one imagines, die, it's a kind of property. It lasts. You name your car, you tell stories about it, etc. But when you lease a car and you drive it for 2 or 3 years and then return it and drive another car, that car, even though it's a piece of property, is an indication of the growing processes of wealth as opposed to property for her. At least that's how I've attempted to understand it over the years. Are there questions? Should I wait a second? So in chapter 16 on the instruments of work and the division of labor, Arendt is trying to do a few things. The first concerns the instruments of work. Now, and she's talking about a couple here. One is tools, right? We create tools, and tools help us lighten our load of labor. And so she begins by saying, well, if you lighten your load of labor too much, you lose a certain kind of your humanity, because part of the human condition is to labor. And so there's this constant struggle in history, where on the one hand, to be human, we want to free ourselves from labor so that we can pursue action and work. On the other hand, if we free ourselves too much from labor, we lose the vitality and liveliness that labor gives to us as human beings. So on page 120, near the bottom, right, that the life of the rich loses in vitality, in closeness to the good things of nature, what it gains in refinement, in sensitivity to the beautiful things in the world, has often been noted. The fact is that the human capacity for life in the world always implies an ability to transcend and to be alienated from the processes of life itself. Right? The human capacity for life in the world implies ability to transcend and be alienated from the processes of life, while vitality and liveliness can be conserved only to the extent that men are willing to take the burden, the toil and trouble of life upon themselves. So what she's saying is that while labor has traditionally been the lowest of the activities of life, and now it's the highest, we shouldn't forget that labor is important. Labor provides vitality and liveliness, and we need to always labor, which raises this question of the rise of tools. And she says robots, right? The next paragraph. It is true that the enormous improvement in our labor tools, the mute robots with which Homo faber has come up to help the animal laborans, as distinguished from the human speaking instruments, namely slaves, whom the man of action had to rule and oppress when he wanted to liberate the animal laborans from its bondage, has made the twofold labor of life, the effort of its sustenance and the pain of giving birth, easier and less painful than it has ever been. Translated, we now have tools, robots, things, machines that make the sustenance of life easier and less painful than it has ever been. We can free ourselves from the curse of necessity, which is less vivid in our lives. But when we do that, she says, we risk losing freedom. So she says the danger here, this is a couple lines down, the danger here is obvious. Man cannot be free if he does not know that he is subject to necessity, right? Because his freedom is always won in his never wholly successful attempts to liberate himself from necessity. So this is maybe a controversial point. I assume it's a controversial point. The point is that if you live a life free from necessity, you're not free. You're luxurious. You have leisure in the sense that you can eat grapes all day. But freedom, to a certain degree, means freeing yourself from. And that the less necessity we actually encounter in our lives, the weaker the futility of freeing it from ourselves feels, and it requires less effort, and there is a reduction, she argues, in freedom. I wonder if that's something people agree with, right? The claim is here that if we were to be able to create a world in which we had to do almost no labor, where machines provided everything for us, we would be, quote unquote, free to do whatever we want. But Arendt is suggesting that we would lose the impulse towards freedom, and in a sense, freedom would become meaningless. Freedom is only meaningful if there's an impulse to free ourselves from necessity. And as necessity weakens, the impulse to freedom weakens. That seems to be the claim. Are there questions at all about what she's saying here about tools? Hegelian, there's a question about Hegelian dialectic. No, I don't think this is about Hegelian dialectic. I think she's interested truly in the question of the division of labor and the rise of tools is making it such that we don't have to worry so much about necessity. Most of us, and again, this is a controversial claim, but most of us don't work out of necessity, right? I mean, if we're just talking about keeping ourselves alive, I see pictures of you all in nice rooms with books and chairs and many things that cost a lot of money. If you just wanted to keep yourself alive, the amount of work you would have to do would be significantly less. The amount of labor you would have to do would be significantly less than you do now. And this is true probably for the poor as well as for the middle class, let alone the rich today. People don't labor, most people in our society, and I know there's exceptions, but most people in our society don't labor to keep themselves alive. They labor to provide themselves money to consume and acquire. And if we, she says, if we would create shuttles that would weave by themselves, and lyres that played themselves, and books that read themselves, and all sorts of things, we would ease life's labor, right? A lot. And yet then she has another point on 122, which is that as much as we would ease life's labor, we would never ease it completely, right? We will never get to the point where we fully automate the easing of life's labor. And the reason, she says, is because there's certain tools we need which are not mechanical, which are human, slaves. And if they're not slaves, they're servants. Very much the discussion in the last 5 to 10 years of the rise of the service economy, the emptying of the factories, and the rise of people who drive Uber and clean your house and shop for people and who knows, take care of their kids, nannies, etc. The rise of the service economy is for her one illustration of the limit of tools to be able to ease our labor. And so there will be a point at which we can't just simply have new tools. We actually need live assistants or people. And this leads to the question of the division of labor, the idea that there will be people who do certain tasks and not other tasks. What this, however, does, and the danger of this from her point of view, is that as we maximize the efficiency of the division of labor, we can create enormous amounts of things, whether it's houses or automobiles or pens, and even things that used to be works that had worldly quality to them can be produced cheaply. New apartments can be produced cheaply with 3D printers, large 3D printers. Nice pens can be produced cheaply. Plates can be produced cheaply. And the result of this rise of tools and division of labor for her is that we are going to create a world of such abundance that, in a sense, we have to discard the products of that abundance regularly in order to buy more of it so that the economy doesn't crash. And in a sense, what we do in this world of abundance, of the division of labor and the rise of tools, is we have such a process of creation of abundance that we have endless production. And if we have endless production, we must have endless consumption. And the only way we can do that is if we assure that products lose their use character, their worldly character, and become mere objects of consumption. This is what she writes on page 125. It may be worth just reading this on 125 near the bottom. She says about 10 lines from the bottom of 125, this is even more evident in the use objects produced by these techniques of laboring. So when we produce by laboring and division of labor use products, right, works that are not supposed to just be consumed, but things that are supposed to last, like hammers or cars or pens, fountain pens, like nice pens, right? She says, if we produce so many of them, their very abundance transforms them into consumer goods, right? That's the line that needs to be paid attention to. The endlessness of the laboring process is guaranteed by the ever-recurrent needs of consumption. The endlessness of production can be assured only if its products lose their use character and become more and more objects of consumption. If we produce millions of hammers, we can only do that if we know that people will do what? Throw away their hammers, put them in the garbage, because there's a new hammer that's got a new color or a new feature or a new something that will make us buy the new one. So the rate of use is so tremendously accelerated that the objective difference between use and consumption, between the relative durability and thus worldliness of use objects, and the swift coming and going of consumer goods, worldlessness, dwindles to insignificance. In our need for the more and more rapid replacement of the worldly things around us, we can no longer afford to use them. To respect and preserve their inherent durability, we must consume, devour, as it were, our houses and furniture and cars as though they were the good things of nature which spoil uselessly if they are not drawn swiftly into the never-ending cycle of man's metabolism with nature. So, are there questions about that? I see one while you think. Bob Meyerson writes again, might it be said, as Kurzweil would suggest, that since Arendt's time, we are becoming our own tools in a self-accepting way, and so we slip away from our human character and turn into the means themselves? Absolutely. If one hears this, of course, in a word that many of you who work for a living hear regularly, which is human resources, right? The idea that we have departments of human resources in every business, profit and nonprofit and government in this country shows us that human beings have become interchangeable resources, tools to be used and consumed. The idea that human beings are simply use objects has integrated itself deeply into the modern way of living and working. I hope that's clear. We'll talk more about it as we go along. Fewer questions this week. Are there other questions? Or do you want to get on to the chapter 17, which is the most interesting chapter in this section in this chapter?
Roger, I have a question.
Yes. Hi, Gary, is that you?
No. My name is Jack.
Hi, Jack.
Hi. This question relates to one of the byproducts of accelerating wealth in this society is an abundance of leisure, and she talks about this a little bit in terms of Marx's prediction that we will be engaged in hobbies. But isn't it true that a lot of the work, for example, the work that we are all doing right now, is a product of that leisure or is the result of that leisure that is produced by this abundance of goods? So that we don't have to labor as much to survive, to keep the biology going, and that gives us, if you like, the time and the opportunity to act freely, to explore the human condition.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and Jack, and it's one that is quite challenging for us as people who you've invoked in your question. In order to answer it, I want to talk a little bit about chapter 17. So let's at least look at page 131, where Jack's question really comes from. And then let me see what I can do to answer it, or at least, if not answer it, speak to it, because I think it is an excellent question. So in the middle of page 131, she writes, and she's talking about Marx's utopia in which we would all have leisure to pursue hobbies like playing tennis or painting or reading Hannah Arendt, right? So it's exactly what Jack is asking about. And she writes, however, not even this utopia could change the essential worldly I'm sorry. Well, okay. Not even this utopia could change the essential worldly futility of the life process. The two stages through which the ever-recurrent cycle of biological life must pass, the stages of labor and consumption, may change their proportion, even to the point where nearly all human labor power is spent consuming, with the concomitant serious social problem of leisure, right, which is what Jack is asking about. That is essentially the problem of how to provide enough opportunity for daily exhaustion to keep the capacity for consumption intact. Now, she then offers a footnote to two different ideas of leisure, right? The old Greek idea of leisure, of skole, right, which, importantly, given Jack's question, is the root of our word scholar or school, so that the leisure of skole was exactly as Jack said, the freedom from necessity, the conscious abstention from necessity and from consuming for political and religious pursuits. Versus what she talks about as the modern idea of leisure, which is the using of spare time to consume. Now, if you turn to the next pages, page 133, she says in the middle of the page, the hope that inspired Marx, and by the way, this is also the hope that Jack is here expressing, and the best men of the various workers' movements, that free time eventually will emancipate men from necessity and make the animal laborans productive, rests on the illusion of a mechanistic philosophy, which assumes that labor power, like any other energy, can never be lost, so that if it is not spent and exhausted in the drudgery of life, it will automatically nourish other higher activities. Namely, if we have free time because we don't have to labor, we can read Hannah Arendt. The guiding model of this hope in Marx was doubtless the Athens of Pericles, which in the future, with the help of the vastly increased productivity of human labor, would need no slaves to sustain itself, but would become a reality for all. And then here's her, at least response, I don't even want to say answer to Jack. 100 years after Marx, we know the fallacy of this reasoning. The spare time of the animal laborans is never spent in anything but consumption. And the more time left to him, the greedier and more craving his appetites. That these appetites become, and here's where we need to really think about what Jack is saying, that these appetites become more sophisticated, so that consumption is no longer restricted to the necessities, but on the contrary, mainly concentrates on the superfluities of life, does not change the character of this society, but harbors the grave danger that eventually no object of the world will be safe from consumption and annihilation through consumption. So, what I can tell you, Jack, if I hope you're still there.
I'm here.
What I can tell you is that when I started the Hannah Arendt Center 17 years ago, this line almost made me not do it. And that is because the danger of something like the Hannah Arendt Center is that we turn Hannah Arendt into another consumption good. We turn Hannah Arendt into something we can, a superfluity of life that we will read and talk about and engage in, but as part of the the desire for sophisticatedness, the desire to appear educated, the desire to, in a sense, have something that almost can't be bought, right? Which is class, or a kind of, je ne sais quoi, something that raises us above other people. Hannah Arendt becomes like hanging a painting by Jasper Johns in your house, a mark of your status. Now, I'm not saying that's what this is at all, but I'm saying that's what she worries about, right? She worries that the consumption of art, like going to museums, which, as you all know, is now museums are, they can't build them big enough or fast enough. Everyone goes to museums. Is this because people are, as she said on page 131, in conscious abstention from necessities and consuming, taking on political and religious pursuits? Or is this because their consumption tastes are becoming more sophisticated and they're seeking something through consumption that's not simply life and necessities, but in a sense, status? This is one of her big worries about the culture industry, right? She has another essay called on culture, in Between Past and Future, in which she worries that in the need to make the great works of art accessible to wide ranges of people who want to read them, so that they have the status of reading them, we, in a sense, dumb down those works. In one sense, simply by translating them, right? Or editing them so that they're more accessible, but also by adapting them, shortening them, making them into movies or plays, or etc. And she worries that the actual engagement with these texts as difficult, meaningful texts could actually be made more difficult by making them more accessible. It's a slightly different point than what Jack has been asking about, but I think Jack's question is a good one. And I think it's one we don't have an answer to so much as it's a question for us. Are we, in a sense, with our leisure today, pursuing spiritual and religious and political activities? Or are we consuming those activities as a means of making ourselves feel better, providing ourselves status, and, in a sense, continuing the consumption activity of our time? I don't have an answer to that. I actually don't think it's helpful to answer that per se. I think it should remain as a question for all of us. Jack, do you or anyone else want to chime into that?
I think you've done a really good job, Roger, of approaching the question, and I agree with you. It's not a question that has an easy or rational answer. But I'm mindful that in this discussion that leads up to this, you were talking about her concept of freedom, and during her lifetime, during her period, there was this idea that came out of, or that was articulated by Erich Fromm, about the distinction between freedom from and freedom to. And I think that readers of his book, Escape from Freedom, might get a sense as to some possibilities that are pointed to here in Hannah Arendt's text.
I think that's good and fair. The question of freedom is raised explicitly by Arendt in the opening pages of Chapter 17, A Consumer Society. And I wanted to return to that. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left. And I thought I'd at least point out some very important points here. So in Chapter 17, she says, we live in a consumer society. which is the same as a society of laborers. And I hope that's become clear with this equation of life equals labor equals consumption. The point is, this is about 5 lines from the bottom of that page, 126. The point is not that for the first time in history, laborers were admitted and given equal rights in the public realm, but that we have almost succeeded in leveling all human activities to the common denominator of securing the necessities of life and providing for their abundance. Whatever we do, we are supposed to do for the sake of making a living, such is the verdict of society. And the number of people, especially in the professions, who might challenge it has decreased rapidly. So there are people who would challenge that, but the number of them has decreased. And she says, the only exception society is willing to grant. Now, this doesn't mean that it's the only exception. And it doesn't mean that all artists who we're about to talk about are actually exceptions. But she says the only exception society is willing to grant is the artist, who, strictly speaking, is the only worker left in a laboring society, namely someone who creates things that last. The same trend to level down all serious activities in the status of making a living is manifest in present-day labor theories, which define labor in opposition to play. As a result, all serious activities, irrespective of their fruits, are called labor, and every activity which is not necessary either for life of the individual or for the life process is subsumed under playfulness. In these theories, which by echoing the current estimate of a laboring society on the theoretical level sharpen it and drive it into its inherent extreme, not even the work of the artist is left. It is dissolved into play and has lost its worldly meaning. The playfulness of the artist is felt to fulfill the same function in the laboring life process of society as the playing of tennis or the pursuit of a hobby fulfills in the life of the individual. And one could add, potentially, reading Hannah Arendt, right? The point here is that in opposing seriousness to playfulness, freedom becomes understood as playfulness. And that's the point she makes in footnote 75, right? Where she says, for modern thinking, this is 4 lines in, playfulness has become the source of freedom. And so this, I think, really does go back to the question Jack is asking, and it's a absolutely essential question. Are we reading Hannah Arendt playfully, or as freely, in the sense of playful, in the sense of it's not our serious work, but it's something we do on the side? Or is Hannah Arendt and reading it what's most important, and we labor on the side in order to allow us to read Hannah Arendt and do what's important? That's the question Hannah Arendt is really pushing us to ask. And what she worries about is that in the elevation of labor and the idea that someone who would spend their lives just reading Hannah Arendt and begging or working in a restaurant in order to pay enough to live in a hovel so that they could read Hannah Arendt would be considered by most people unserious. Whereas the person who works and does quite well and has some extra time and reads Hannah Arendt on the side is considered to be playing and not being serious. Now, that may not be right for that person. She's not saying that nobody is serious in reading Hannah Arendt. You guys all may be. What she's saying is society doesn't recognize it. A laboring society doesn't recognize it.
Good. Very good.
We've gone an hour. This is chapter 17 is a wonderfully important chapter. If you're interested, we'll get there eventually, but chapters 42 and 45 at the end of the book further explain basic understandings of what she's talking about here in chapter 17. And if you're interested in have some time to read ahead, I would encourage you to do so. Otherwise, we'll come back next month and start the chapter on work, which will allow us to really start to think about the world and what she means by worldliness in that. Thank you guys all very much. I hope you have a happy holiday if you're celebrating any of the holidays this weekend, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
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 Bye.